It wasn't the night he stopped loving me, it was the night I stopped recognizing myself. As I look back now, I still wonder when it all began to unravel. I had never imagined myself in this position, reflecting on a marriage that once felt like solid ground, now fractured in ways I could barely name. I was an ordinary wife, a woman who once believed that love, when carefully tended, would be enough. Mark and I had been married for 7 years. He was intelligent, ambitious, the kind of man who inspired confidence in every room he entered. He worked at a prestigious corporate firm, and while I admired his dedication, somewhere along the line, his job had consumed him entirely. Our conversations dwindled to logistics, groceries, bills, work calls. And somehow, I had vanished in the space between those sentences. I work from home as a freelance graphic designer. At first, it was lovely freedom, quiet, the ability to pour myself into what I loved. But slowly, that quiet turned into something else. Loneliness. I missed connection. I missed being seen. Mark and I used to talk for hours. We had dreams, inside jokes, quiet moments that didn't need words. I remembered the way he once waited for me outside the train station in the rain, holding flowers even though he hated gestures like that. I missed that man desperately. But now, even when we were in the same room, it felt like we were worlds apart. But peace is a thin veil, and when it tears, you see all the fractures beneath. Mark was constantly on his phone, talking about deadlines and clients. I would try to engage him, share a new design I was working on, suggest a weekend away, ask about his day. His answers were always the same. Later. I'm swamped. Not now. It was during one of his work dinners that I first met Jonathan. Mark had finally received a long-awaited promotion, and the company threw a formal celebration at an upscale downtown restaurant. I nearly didn't go. By then, I felt more like a roommate than a partner. But I put on a dress, styled my hair, and played the role of the supportive wife. The restaurant buzzed with chatter and clinking glasses. Mark was in his element, shaking hands, introducing me to colleagues. Then he turned to a man slightly older than him, mid-40s, sharp suit, steel blue eyes, and said, "This is Jonathan. He's technically my boss." Jonathan smiled and took my hand. "It's wonderful to finally meet the woman behind the man," he said. His grip was firm, but warm. His gaze lingered, not inappropriately, but long enough to register. I laughed and made a light comment about how often Mark talked about work at home. "I feel like I already know half of you," I joked. Jonathan smiled again, something unreadable flickering behind his eyes. We only spoke briefly, but throughout the evening, I noticed him glancing my way. At the time, I didn't think much of it. Weeks passed. Our home remained cold, though never confrontational. It was as if we were both holding our breath, pretending everything was still okay. Then Mark casually mentioned another company dinner. He seemed reluctant, said he might just skip it. But I offered to go with him. I don't know why. Maybe I just didn't want to sit home alone again. That night, I ended up sitting beside Jonathan. Conversation flowed easily. He asked about my work, not just politely but with genuine interest. He asked how I came up with my designs, what inspired me, what my favorite creative tools were. Mark hadn't asked me those things in years. When the evening ended, Jonathan smiled as he left and said, "I'd love to hear more about your work sometime." It started simply enough. A LinkedIn message complimenting a project I'd posted. Then an email asking if I could recommend a freelancer for a side campaign he was overseeing. Then a coffee invitation to talk shop. I told myself it was harmless. Mark never had time for these things. What harm could a coffee meeting cause? But when I caught myself changing my outfit twice before I left the house that day, I knew. I wasn't just excited to talk about design. I was excited to see him. And I hated that I was. I kept telling myself it was nothing. Just professional curiosity. Just polite conversation. But each time my phone buzzed, a flicker of anticipation lit up inside me. I started paying more attention to how I looked. Little things. Lipstick I hadn't worn in months, a different perfume, a dress that Mark had long stopped noticing. We exchanged messages more often. They were light, even funny. He'd comment on my designs, send articles about art, ask my opinion on colors and font styles. It felt good. It felt safe. Until it didn't. One afternoon, he sent me a message about a new art exhibit in the city, something experimental, modern, raw. "You'd love this," he wrote. Mark had meetings that night. Again. So, I went. I told myself it was harmless. But the moment I walked in and saw Jonathan already waiting, his smile warm, his jacket draped over, his arm like he belonged in that space, I felt something shift. He walked beside me through the gallery, listening as I talked about brushstrokes and lighting, and offered thoughts of his own that surprised me. He wasn't just making conversation. He was listening. And for the first time in years, I felt like my words mattered. When I got home, Mark was on his laptop, fingers flying across the keyboard, phone buzzing at his side. "Hey," I said softly. He didn't look up.
"Hey.
"How was your night?" "Fine." He didn't ask more. Didn't turn around. I stood in the doorway for a few seconds, watching the light from the screen flicker across his face, the man I'd once believed would always see me. I wanted to tell him about the gallery, the sculpture that reminded me of something I'd once drawn as a child. How I felt like myself again. But I didn't. I knew he wouldn't listen. Or worse, he'd listen, but not hear. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering how many conversations we'd left unfinished. How many nights like this we'd silently survived without noticing the pieces falling away. And I realized something that terrified me. I wasn't just emotionally connected to Jonathan. I was starting to crave him. It wasn't about romance. Not really. It was about feeling seen. Feeling chosen. Mark and I barely talked anymore. And when we did, it was transactional. What to buy. What time to leave. Who's doing laundry. He'd stopped looking at me. And I'd stopped fighting to be looked at. One evening, I made dinner his favorite. I set the table with care, lit a candle, even left my phone in the other room. I wanted it to be like before. Just one night where we sat and talked and laughed like we used to. When he got home, he muttered a distracted "smells good," and sat down without a glance. Midway through the meal, his phone rang. "I've got to take this," he said, rising. And just like that, he disappeared. I sat staring at his empty plate, the flickering candle, the silence. And then I did something I swore I wouldn't do. I picked up my phone and messaged Jonathan. Just a simple comment about a painting. Something I knew he'd appreciate. He replied instantly. And I felt something lift off my chest. Like I could finally breathe again. That night, we messaged until nearly 2 a.m. We talked about dreams, about childhood, about art and failure, and why some people forget how to dream. He asked what scared me most, and without thinking, I told him. Becoming invisible. He didn't reply immediately. Then, "You're the most visible person I know." I stared at that sentence for a long time. Jonathan saw me. Not just as someone's wife. Not as an obligation. He saw me messy, creative, lonely, searching, and didn't look away. And I couldn't help wondering. When had Mark stopped looking? The days blurred together. I found myself checking my phone more than I should, watching for Jonathan's name to appear. Every message lit up something inside me that had long gone dark. And yet, I still clung to the illusion. We were just talking. Nothing physical. No affair. At least, that's what I told myself. But I knew better. Deep down, I understood that I was building a bridge between two emotional worlds, and I had already crossed too far. One afternoon, Jonathan asked if I was free for lunch. His message was casual, but my heart leapt in a way that frightened me. I hesitated, told myself I shouldn't go, but I said yes anyway. We met at a cozy little restaurant tucked away in a quiet part of the city. The lighting was soft, the music gentle. It felt intimate. Too intimate. He asked about my latest design project. I told him about an idea I'd been sketching for weeks. One that no one had asked about. Not even Mark. Jonathan leaned in, eyes focused. "You light up when you talk about your work. Do you know that?" I blushed. I didn't mean to. Afterward, he walked me to my car. The moment was quiet, charged. Then he reached out and gently tucked a strand of hair behind my ear. It was nothing. A small gesture. A flick of fingers and breath. But it felt like everything. I froze. I should have stepped back. Should have said something. Instead, I just stood there, looking up at him, saying nothing. Later that night, lying beside Mark, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about that moment, his hand, his eyes, the way I didn't flinch, the way I wanted more. I hated myself for it. I hated that I wanted to go back. We began seeing each other more often, always under the guise of business, a coffee, a gallery talk, a quick lunch. But the truth was, we didn't talk about work anymore. We talked about fear, about the weight of obligation, about the things we wanted but were afraid to ask for. He told me he once wanted to be an illustrator. I told him I once wanted to write poetry. We laughed, and sometimes we sat in silence that felt safer than words. I kept telling myself, this isn't cheating. But I started deleting messages, hiding my phone screen, watching Mark's eyes, wondering if he knew. One evening, Mark came home earlier than usual. I was sitting on the couch, phone in hand, deep in conversation with Jonathan. I didn't hear the door open. Didn't see him standing there. "Who are you texting?" His voice startled me. I fumbled to lock my screen, but it was too late. He saw the expression on my face. "Just a friend," I said too quickly. Mark didn't yell. He didn't accuse. He just looked at me, long and quiet. "You've been acting strange," he said. "You know that." I laughed, too sharply. "You've barely looked at me in months." And there it was. The fracture turned fault line. He sat across from me and stared for a long time. "I may have been distracted," he said. "But I always assumed you were still here." And I realized he had been blind, yes, but I had been hiding. That night, he didn't touch his phone once. He sat at the table while I cooked, didn't speak, just watched me move around the kitchen with an expression I couldn't read. And for the first time, guilt hit me like a wave. Because he was still my husband. Because even if he had failed to see me, I had failed to stay. The next day, Jonathan asked to see me. "Just a coffee," he said. But I knew better. I met him anyway. We sat in a quiet corner of a cafe we hadn't visited before. The moment I saw his smile, warm, familiar, like he'd been waiting only for me, I almost forgot why I had come. But I remembered. And this time, I didn't ignore it. "This is wrong," I said. My voice shook. Jonathan looked at me, eyes soft but steady. "Is it?" he asked. "I'm married. I know. I can't keep doing this." He leaned back in his chair and nodded, slow, sad. "The thought of losing you hurts." "It hurts me too. But I have to try to fix what I broke." He didn't try to change my mind. He just sat there. And then he said something that stayed with me longer than I wanted it to. "I saw you before he did. And I think I'll keep seeing you, even if I never get to again." That night, I didn't sleep. I lay awake thinking about the line I'd crossed, the man I'd almost chosen, and the life I'd almost left behind. And I wondered if there was any way to go back, or if I'd wandered too far. 2 days passed. Then Mark called me into the kitchen. He was standing by the counter, arms crossed, holding my phone. "I read the messages," he said quietly. I froze. "You left it unlocked." I felt the blood drain from my face. "I thought we were just going through a hard time," he continued. "I thought we'd find our way back. So I waited. I kept waiting to see if you'd come back on your own." I opened my mouth, but he raised his hand. "Just tell me the truth. Did you love him?" I stood there, unsure how to answer. Did I love Jonathan? Or did I love the way he made me feel? Alive, desired, seen? "I don't know," I whispered. Mark looked away. Not angry, just tired. He left the room without another word. And in that silence, everything fell apart. We tried. Therapy. Late-night conversations. Tears. Promises. But there are things that, once broken, don't go back to what they were. Mark stopped looking at me the same way. I stopped pretending I was still the woman I'd been when we married. We drifted apart like two boats untethered by a storm. Eventually we separated. Not with rage. Not with drama. just with the slow sadness of two people who lost each other by inches until nothing was left to hold on to. I never saw Jonathan again. He didn't reach out, didn't ask what happened, didn't say goodbye. Some nights, I wonder if he still thinks of me, if he ever looks back and wonders what might have been. But I try not to live in those questions, because in the end, the worst part wasn't losing Mark or Jonathan. It was realizing that somewhere along the way I had lost myself. I had become a woman waiting for someone else to validate her worth. A woman shrinking to fit into a marriage that no longer had room for her voice. And walking away wasn't the hardest part. Looking in the mirror and finally seeing that truth, that was. Now, I live alone. I paint again. I wake early and go for walks before the city wakes. I don't look for closure anymore. Some things don't close. They just shift and settle into the quiet places of your life. I've learned not to chase what isn't chasing me. And when I pass couples in cafes or watch wedding scenes in old movies, I feel something strange. Not regret, not longing, just awareness of how easy it is to forget who you are until someone sees you. And sometimes that someone isn't a lover or a friend. Sometimes it's you coming back to yourself after being gone too long. So if you're still here, still listening, tell me honestly, have you ever been seen by someone and realized how invisible you'd become? Because sometimes the story isn't about betrayal. It's about the cost of not being seen and the courage it takes to look back and begin again. If this story stirred something inside you, give it a like and subscribe to Tales of Euphoria. There's always another story waiting to be told, or maybe waiting to find you.